How far would you go to fulfill your desire to be a mother? Jung Minseo is willing to go to great lengths, even turning to a co-parenting agency. What she never imagined was that the man chosen to be the father of her child would be Kang, the powerful CEO of KS Group. Amidst tensions, unexpected proposals, and uncontrollable growing feelings, they both find themselves at a crossroads where they will not only decide the future of a child but also the path of their own hearts. Jung Minseo crossed the glass door with a knot in her stomach, holding a folder bearing the logo of the co-parenting agency. She was about to enter the room where she would meet the man who could be the father of her child. Her mother had called it madness, but Minseo knew she had no other choice. The women in her family had experienced early menopause, her mother at 40 and her grandmother even earlier. 35, Minseo had no time for dating or relationships that would lead nowhere. The idea of a co-parenting agency had come to her after a sleepless night. This agency promised confidentiality and men who sought the same as she did, to form a family without romance, simply as partners in raising a child. She wanted to give her child what she had lacked, a present father. She couldn't allow her baby to grow up with the same absence that had marked her life. The receptionist stopped her before she entered the room. "Miss Jung, could you sign here?" she said, pointing to a line at the bottom of a contract. "It's a confidentiality agreement. What's discussed in this meeting cannot be disclosed to third parties or the media." Minseo signed, feeling intrigue tightening in her throat. After returning the folder to the receptionist, she entered the room with restrained steps. The place was discreetly lit, and at the back she saw a man seated at a dark wooden table, his hands clasped together. When he looked up at her, Minseo froze. "Kang," she murmured, astonished. There he was, the CEO of KS Group, the man whose photos appeared in every business magazine, the most influential entrepreneur in Seoul. She struggled to process how someone like him had ended up in that room, seeking the same thing as she was. Jihun looked at her with calm, unwavering composure. "By the way you're looking at me, I take it you know who I am," he said, his voice as low as it was steady. "I requested they not tell you my name to avoid distractions." Minseo tried to steady herself, but she couldn't hide her shock. This was surreal. Kang Jihun leaned back in his chair, observing the woman who had just entered the room. Jung Minseo, a child psychologist and a leader in her field. He had reviewed her profile in detail, just as he had with other candidates, but Minseo wasn't just any option. Minseo worked helping children from dysfunctional families and had written articles on the importance of building a safe and stable environment for children. To Jihun, this made her perfect. He wanted his future child to grow up with the same sense of security he'd had. His childhood, marked by his parents' love, was something he wanted to replicate. He had personally requested additional information about her. He wanted to know more about the woman who seemed to understand what it meant to form a family based on connection. He wanted to offer his child a stable life, something no amount of wealth could buy. And Minseo, at 35, seemed to be racing against time as well, driven by something beyond a simple desire to be a mother. Between them, an invisible bond was established, a tacit understanding. "The agency offers us a very structured process," Jihun explained, his tone confident and measured. "A specialized clinic will guide us step by step. There are several fertility options, and we can choose the one that suits us best." Minseo nodded in silence, listening without interrupting. Jihun outlined the schedule of medical appointments, custody agreements, and even a cohabitation plan. "And about cohabitation," he added, glancing at her sideways, "I thought we could—" Minseo raised a hand, signaling him to stop. "I don't think that's possible, Mr. Kang," she said in a calm but firm voice. "No?" Jihun blinked, trying to understand. "May I ask why?" She sighed and lowered her gaze for a moment before meeting his eyes again. Her expression was calm, but her eyes reflected a deep sorrow. "I appreciate all of this, truly." And I'm surprised by the level of detail and commitment you have, but you're not what I'm looking for, she said without hesitation. I grew up watching my mother work for a big company, sacrificing herself every day, and though she wasn't a CEO, she suffered a lot in that environment. I know what it's like to form a family in a setting like that. And honestly, I don't want my child growing up in a world like that. Jihun nodded, feeling something slip through his fingers, though he couldn't help but understand her in part. Is it the level of commitment? Because I can assure you, even though my job is demanding, this is very important to me. Minseo shook her head. It's not that you wouldn't follow through, Jihun. It's about the life that surrounds you, the intensity of your environment. I don't want my child to grow up surrounded by meetings, events, and trips. I also don't want them to be seen solely as the CEO's child. I just want something simpler for them. Something stable. Her words hit him with the force of a truth he hadn't expected to hear. He wanted to explain that his commitment was sincere, that he too was willing to prioritize his future child. But the moment had passed, and her decision was firm. Minseo stood up and gave him a respectful bow. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Kang," she said with a soft smile. "But I think it's best if we go our separate ways." Before Jihun could respond, she turned and left the room without looking back. He was left in silence, staring at the empty space in front of him. Jung Minseo arrived at the children's center where she worked, her steps hurried. As soon as she set foot in the break area, she was met by Yoonji, her best friend and colleague, who looked at her with a face full of intrigue. Minseo had told her about her decision to go to the agency, and it didn't surprise her that Yoonji was now waiting, arms crossed and clearly impatient. "So, how did it go?" Yoonji asked, raising her eyebrows, visibly curious. Minseo put down her bag and sighed. "You're not going to believe it, the candidate was none other than Kang Jihun, the CEO of KS Group," she murmured, lowering her voice as if afraid someone might hear. Yoonji's eyes widened. "What? Kang Jihun?" she repeated in an excited whisper. It was no secret that Kang Jihun was one of Korea's most powerful businessmen and one of the most sought-after men. "So? What did you do?" Minseo made a face before answering. "I turned him down." Yoonji let out an incredulous snort. "You turned down Kang Jihun? I mean, if it's him, it's clear that he's not just any man you can say no to so easily." Minseo looked away, uncomfortable. She knew what her friend was getting at, but she had thought a lot about her decision. "It's precisely because it's him that I don't want to do it," Minseo explained, sighing. "Jihun is a man willing to commit, I know that, but it doesn't change the life he leads or his position. He'd be surrounded by events, pressure, like he'd always have to be under the spotlight. And I've seen the damage that life can cause." She paused, reflecting. "My mother sacrificed her life in that environment, always busy, thinking she was giving me the best. But in the end, we missed out on so many moments." Yoonji frowned, more serious. "But he seems really committed, doesn't he? You'd be sharing the load, not like your mother, who was always alone." "That's what he doesn't understand," Minseo admitted in a low voice. "It's not just about his commitment. It's about the world he represents, and I don't want my child to be in the middle of that." Yoonji nodded, finally understanding. "Well, if that's your decision, then I support you. Just make sure you're certain." Minseo smiled gratefully, grabbed her bag, and headed for the exit. Sometimes her decisions seemed difficult to understand, but Yoonji always listened and supported her. They said goodbye, and hours later, Minseo left the building with a sense of clarity. But as soon as she stepped out of the doors, she stopped in her tracks. There, standing right in front of her, was Kang Jihun, waiting for her with the same determined expression he'd had in the meeting. Minseo stirred her coffee, glancing at him from the corner of her eye while Kang Jihun remained serious, arms crossed and with a determined expression. From the moment she ran into him outside her office, he hadn't given her any choice but to agree to a talk. Now, in that small cafe nearby, He was watching her as if he were willing to do anything to convince her. "You can't take no for an answer, can you?" she said, smiling a little nervously as she took a sip of coffee. Jihun flashed a faint, almost mocking smile. "No," he replied straightforwardly. "I could find another candidate, of course. The agency offered me several. But I chose you, Minseo. And when I make a decision, I don't go back on it." She set the cup down on its saucer with a slight sigh. "Maybe I should remind you that I was the one who said no. It's your ego that won't let you accept my refusal, and I assure you there are plenty of women who would love to be the mother of your child. I don't understand why you have to insist on me." Jihun looked at her, resting an arm on the table and leaning toward her with a hint of amusement in his gaze. "Are you psychoanalyzing me?" "Is that it?" he said half-jokingly. "But it's not about ego, Minseo. I chose you because I thought you could see the future I want for my child. And because, unlike other women, I know you could give him the stability I'm hoping for." Minseo stared at him, trying to pinpoint the exact line where his seriousness ended and that unshakable part of him, the one that made him so certain, began. She took a breath, searching for the right words, but he spoke first. "Listen," he said, with the same determination as always. "I'm not asking you to trust blindly. Just give me a chance to show you what my life is really like. I want you to see that it's not as you imagine." Minseo hesitated, but the intensity in Jihun's eyes, that confidence in his gaze, did something she hadn't expected. She agreed, at least, to give him a chance to prove her wrong. "All right, Jihun," she said finally, looking him straight in the eyes. "Show me what your world is really like." 2 days later, Minseo finished her meetings early and waited for Jihun to pick her up. She was surprised when he appeared exactly on time, dressed much more casually than usual. In silence, he opened the car door for her, and once they were on the road, he headed toward a residential area she didn't know well. "To start, I want to show you something important," Jihun said, his gaze focused on the road. Minseo nodded, intrigued. A few minutes later, the car stopped in front of a spacious 2-story house surrounded by a garden filled with flowers and neatly trimmed bushes. The house had the calm charm Minseo had always dreamed of, and she couldn't help but stare at it. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he commented, smiling as he noticed her reaction. "This is the house I want to buy. It's close enough to the city, in an area with excellent schools and safe green spaces for the child." Minseo looked at him, somewhat surprised. "Are you thinking of us living here?" "Exactly. The house has 2 completely independent floors connected by an internal staircase. We could have our privacy but stay connected so the child would have access to both of us at all times. Each of us would have our own space, but we could also share in day-to-day life." Minseo remained silent, picturing the place filled with life, laughter, and a peaceful childhood, and she couldn't help but imagine the kind of life they could give a child there. "It's more than I imagined," she admitted softly. Jihun nodded, pleased with her reaction, and after a brief pause, he asked her to accompany him to their next stop, his office. When they arrived, he led her to his office. "I know you're concerned about my life as a CEO," he began, "but I'm not the typical executive who lives in constant meetings. I have trusted people in place. My second-in-command, Seongjin, has worked with me for years, and he'll take on many of my responsibilities. My plan is for him to handle most of the daily decisions during the early years of parenting." "And your travels?" Minseo asked, looking at him with curiosity. "I'll reduce them to a minimum. Most can be delegated or done virtually. Plus, during that time, I'll work from home as much as possible." She nodded, feeling that his answers were easing some of her worries. He had thought of every detail. "What's more," Jihun added with a smile, "our company has a strict rest hour policy. No one responds to messages outside of work hours, and certainly not on weekends." Minseo looked at him, surprised. "Really? That's not common here." "I know. My father passed away from stomach cancer caused by years of excessive stress. When that happened, I decided to rethink how we worked. I believe in a healthy balance, and it's what I want for my child's future." In silence, Minseo listened to him. For the first time, her image of Kang Jihun as an unyielding CEO began to shift. Minseo dropped her head into her hands, sighing as she watched the pot boiling in front of her. The aroma of the stew mixed with the scent of soju, giving her the warm, comforting feeling she so badly needed. Across from her, Yoonji looked at her with raised eyebrows, as if waiting for her to finally speak. "So what has you so confused?" Yoonji asked, pouring another glass of soju. Minseo took a sip, organizing her thoughts. "I don't know, Yoonji. Everything Jin has proposed sounds good, too good," she admitted. "Not only has he found a perfect house, but he's made sure I have my own space. And regarding work, he's planned everything to reduce his travels, delegate, and even work from home. What if he's hiding something?" Yoonji laughed, shaking her head. "Like what? A dark secret? I don't know." Minseo placed her glass on the table, thoughtful. "It just seems too convenient." Yoonji looked at her, more serious now. "Look, if you have doubts before making a decision, get to know him a bit more. Be direct. Ask him about your concerns and let him give you an answer." Minseo nodded, considering the advice. After all, he had been clear that he wanted to convince her. Minseo looked at the facade of the building where Kang Jihun lived, trying to decipher who this man really was. When he opened the door to his apartment and invited her in, she braced herself to find a cold and calculated space. But as she crossed the threshold, she was surprised. Far from the impersonal image she'd imagined, Jihun's apartment had a warm touch and was full of details. There were framed photos on the shelves, pictures of his family in what seemed like important, joyful moments. Everything was immaculate, yes, but it wasn't rigid. Each corner seemed to hold a purpose, a memory, or a story to tell. "Are they your parents?" Minseo asked, pointing to a photo of a smiling couple on a beach. "Yes," Jihun responded, a soft smile smoothing his expression. "My parents always preferred a simple life. They taught me to value what truly matters, something I try not to forget, even if my life seems otherwise." Minseo nodded, for the first time feeling a bit more connected to him. When they sat on the sofa, she took out her notebook from her bag and opened it, aware that Jihun was watching her with a raised eyebrow and an intrigued smile. "Is this some psychologist's trick to analyze me?" he joked, looking at her with a spark of amusement in his eyes. Minseo chuckled and shook her head. "Just practical questions." He relaxed, leaning back slightly on the sofa as if ready for anything. "Go ahead, ask whatever you want." Minseo smiled and threw out her first question, keeping a professional tone but with a slight smile. "You said you'd reduce your travels to be present. How do you plan to handle it? Can you really set aside so many responsibilities?" Jihun nodded without hesitation. "I have a strong team, and my second-in-command will handle many of my responsibilities. I want to be there for every important moment, and for that I need to make adjustments. And I'm completely willing to do that." As the questioning continued, Minseo found herself surprised by how comfortable he seemed. He answered each question calmly, sometimes even disarming her with a smile that made her feel more intrigued each time. Not only by his responses but by the way he looked at her, that intensity that almost made her lose her train of thought. And there was also that tingling, a warm, indescribable sensation rising in her stomach. "So, are you satisfied or are you planning to ask me more difficult questions?" Jihun asked in a low whisper, leaning in slightly. Minseo felt his closeness, his voice resonating in the air, charged with a subtle but undeniable tension. "For now, I think that's enough," she said, closing her notebook and standing up. She felt the urge to stay a bit longer, but there were too many mixed emotions in the air. Jihun stood as well, accompanying her to the door. Before leaving, she turned and looked at him one last time, wondering for a moment if she was about to make too big a decision. But she said nothing more and walked out, letting the silence settle between them. When she got home and was about to fall asleep, the sound of her phone startled her. It was a message from Yoonji. "Minseo, have you seen the news? They took photos of you leaving Kang Jihun's apartment. You'll be in all the headlines tomorrow." With a sick feeling in her stomach, she opened the attached image, a photo of her leaving Jihun's building. The headlines were already speculating about a supposed relationship between them, and Minseo couldn't begin to imagine how her life would change by morning. She put her phone on the nightstand and lay staring at the ceiling, trying to calm the whirlwind of thoughts swirling through her mind. Seeing her image leaving Jihun's building in all the headlines was something she'd never envisioned when she started this process, and her stomach churned just thinking about how it could affect her life. However, she set that worry aside and thought about him, the image of Jihun walking her to the door of his apartment, his calm gaze, and the way he had listened and answered without evasions. Jihun wasn't just the self-assured CEO everyone knew. He had shown a level of commitment she hadn't expected to find. His plan, his willingness to adjust his life, even the kind of home he envisioned for their future child. Everything aligned with what she had always wanted. She knew he could give her child what she herself had missed: a shared home, a steady presence, a stable role model. And though she tried to deny it, she couldn't ignore the reality of how she felt around him. There was a closeness between them that she hadn't sought, but that now had her heart caught in a vice. As much as she was afraid to admit it, Jihun stirred a mix of curiosity and emotion in her that went beyond the professional. He was the kind of man she could imagine a future with for her child, but also the kind of man who was beginning to mean something more to her. Minseo closed her eyes and took a deep breath, finally accepting that yes, she wanted this. She wanted her child to grow up with someone like Jihun. The next morning, Minseo woke up to her phone vibrating on the nightstand. She saw Jihun's name on the screen and, taking a deep breath, swiped to answer. Minseo, I'm so sorry about the photos. I managed to get them pulled from the headlines. No one should have invaded our privacy like that, he said, his tone serious. I didn't want you to be caught up in all of this, especially before you'd made a decision. Minseo smiled slightly on the other end, realizing that he was genuinely trying to protect her. Don't worry, Jihun. In the end, they'll talk even more when they find out I'm going to have your child, she replied, her tone calm, though her heart pounded as she said it. A second of silence followed her words. Does that mean you've decided? He asked in a low, almost incredulous tone. Yes, Minseo said, letting out a sigh. You've convinced me. Let's do this. Let's have a child together. Jihun's response was a silence that seemed to fill the air between them with a mix of surprise and relief. Minseo couldn't help but smile, knowing she had just made a decision that would change their lives forever. During the days they spent together organizing every detail, Minseo began to feel something inside her shift. Jihun wasn't just the cold, calculating CEO she had imagined at first. With each conversation, each plan, and each idea they shared, he revealed a side of himself that she found impossible to ignore. His patient way of listening, noticing her worries without her having to say a word, the depth in his gaze when he thought about the future. She found herself growing attracted to him, and this connection she'd never anticipated was becoming more intense with each passing day. After leaving the fertility clinic, they both walked in silence, processing the information the doctors had given them about the hormonal treatments and their effects, the procedures and exams. The thought of the entire process felt invasive and exhausting. That was when Jihun broke the silence. All of this is quite complex, don't you think? He said, his voice calm yet direct. I feel like the process is filled with unnecessary steps and requirements. It would be much easier to do this naturally. Minseo stopped in her tracks, looking at him, half disbelieving and half surprised. What? Are you serious? He shrugged. his expression somewhere between amusement and seriousness. I really believe that. Since we're going to be parents together, doing it naturally isn't so far-fetched. Just until you get pregnant. It would be a more straightforward arrangement without the medical interventions we saw today. Minseo looked at him intently, searching for any hint that he was joking, but he maintained that intensity that had disarmed her so many times. He took a step toward her, and suddenly the closeness between them felt like a bond she couldn't break. "I don't want you to have to go through all of that," he said quietly, his gaze never leaving hers. "It's about planting a seed together, something we could do without all that strain." Minseo felt her pulse quicken and a warmth rose to her cheeks. Planting a seed, what a way to put it, she thought nervously as her eyes almost involuntarily drifted toward his lips. She liked them. She liked all of him too much. The idea of trying it even just once with that goal in mind was surprisingly tempting. The dark gleam in Jihun's eyes only intensified the palpable tension between them. Finally, she took a deep breath and looked at him, accepting what she'd been feeling for days. "All right. I accept. Let's do it." In the next chapter, the spark between Minseo and Jihun transforms into something more than a simple agreement. But as the challenges of fertility and Minseo's fears threaten their happiness, they'll have to confront their deepest feelings. Will they be able to overcome the obstacles and build a family? Did you get hooked on the story? Leave us a like and subscribe so you don't miss the upcoming chapters. What would you do if you were in Minseo's place? Share your thoughts in the comments and let's talk about this thrilling K-drama together.